Welcome everyone, this is going to be video slash class 2 of how to draw realistically for absolute beginners. Of course, you don't have to be a beginner to probably get some of the benefit from the classes. I do, however, like to design the course videos to be very short and dense in principle. Well, I prefer the word concise without leaving out too much information, which is why the exercises are quite important. Because I can talk about the principle for like 2 hours and give you all kinds of examples and explanations and talk about the principles for any questions that might pop up for some people, and it probably gets really boring. Or I can just give you the core information. You just have to do a few exercises yourself combined with some feedback and be hopefully like, oh, I get it. And even if you have some questions then, especially if there is a common question, I can then address those. Alright, a quick review from lesson 1, which is that realistic drawing is about drawing what you see, not what you think symbolically about how something is. In the real world, what we see is really different shapes and gradients and contrast between them, which we then reduce to simple symbolic outlines in our heads. When you put stuff down on paper, you have to not do that beyond guidelines. You have to draw what you actually see. I give you the exercise to demonstrate this, which is drawing a cube and a sphere. And if you have done the exercises and have seen the feedback videos, you should be in pretty good shape. Okay, so now we made this fundamental leap to draw realistically in idea. We're getting to more skill-based stuff. This video is about shading, and I'm gonna break it down to 3 parts. Going straight to the point. Number 1, you need to have a scale to think about shading and be able to reproduce any particular shade. This is the easy part. Number 2, you need to be able to evaluate what you see, whatever it is, real life, a picture reference, a reference on a computer, and determine fairly accurately what value you actually see. And then it basically goes back to point number 1, you just have to match it. And 3, just as important, but it's a little bit vague, this is going to be some general tips and tricks and mistakes and pitfalls people often make and how to navigate around all that. And trust me, you don't want to skip this part. Okay, so I'm going to use Photoshop to demonstrate a lot of my points because they are principle based and nothing that I do here couldn't be replicated in soft charcoal. And it is much easier for me to keep up with my planning and thoughts this way. Plus later on, I'll make a video just on some of the specific techniques I personally use a lot with traditional charcoal. Okay, there are a bunch of things on screen and I'll go through them. But before doing that, let me just quickly talk about skill 1, which is able to reproduce a shade. I don't think I need to spend too much time on this. If you know you want to create this particular shade, I think we can all do it fairly easily in terms of technically matching the value. If you made it too dark, lighten it up with the eraser or whatever to use. Too light, make it darker. So to create and match value is not too complicated. The question then is to know and correctly evaluate what value to create. So the smooth gradient on top represents the full range of tone value we can use in an ideal situation. It is now set as the widest range of value as possible on this particular screen. The picture on the right represents a reference that has a full range of values. It has the lightest light to the almost full black. Now the slightly trickier and important concept. I will jump around a bit, but try to stay with me here, because this concept is half a semester in art school. Any reference you use, regardless of type, will have a value range determined from the brightest part on the reference to the darkest part. Any material you use as an artist, including the paper, by same concept will have a value range limit, from the brightest effect you can make to the darkest. For example, most time the brightest you can make is just the natural white of the paper. When you use tone paper, it is the white value of paint or white pastel pencil or whatever medium you use for highlights. And the darkest value you can make as an artist often depends on the tools by the same notion. It is not going to be the same if you are using soft charcoal versus hard graphite or sepia pastel. The key here is the reference has a limit, a bracket on its tone range, and your ability to create your own tone range has a limit of its own. Now I want you to think in terms of percentage of darkest value when thinking about tone value. How dark and light a shade is For the sake of argument, 100% or a 10 is the darkest value. This way of thinking applies to references and your drawings, and 0 is a wide end. Now keep in mind, I said 100% is the darkest value, and it is relative. For you as an artist, it is the darkest value you can make. For the reference, it is the darkest part of the reference. But the actual objective value of those two, 100%, can be different. Same with highlights. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Now, if your tone range, again by that I mean the tone range you can create, exceeds or equal to the reference, you can just copy the reference. Because whatever value the reference contains, you are also capable of making. So just by making sure all areas are equal in value, you will be able to draw and transfer realistically just by looking at the reference. This is the simplest scenario and also the most common if you use charcoal, because you can go from pure white to really dark. Whatever part of reference you focus on, you just need to determine its value, then put that same value on paper. Of course, this is easier said than done, right? It requires practice. But since the logic is so straightforward, there is no shortcut. It is like teaching someone to ride a bicycle. Once you explain that you need to get up to a certain speed and then use the handle to keep the balance, the rest is really just practice. There's not much else you can say. A quick note here. There are gadgets and things that can initially make this tone matching process easier, such as you can print the strip of tone out and simply put it next to the reference so you can determine which part is what value. But in the long run, such tools always puts limitations on what you can do. You're gonna have a really hard time drawing from life, from imagination, or make any value changes from any reference. So I highly recommend you simply train your eye to do the job, and it really isn't that hard. Now I want to talk about technique principle a bit. Still assuming the tone value we can make is enough for the reference. As a beginner, to put that correct corresponding tone value down is the key, and it's difficult. This is where we make things simpler by grouping and have less groups of tone value. The less the group there is, the easier it is to determine what value you see belongs in what box, in that sense, right? Sure, we sacrifice some accuracy initially, but it is a good starting place, and you can then always adjust your drawing. And here is why I recommend you to use the 5-value system, especially if you are like a really big beginner. This is actually used by a lot of masters actually. Basically, the most important skill is to be able to look at something and then correctly put it into one of those 5 boxes. That's all. This is the main skill you need to work on. To be able to look at any shade and say which box it belongs to or closest to. Don't get me wrong, if you can accurately place any value you see correctly into the 10-value system box, go for it. You're going to have a much quicker and more accurate result. And with experience, we will all get more accurate. But early on, there is no need. You see, with the 5-value scale system, you are actually not limiting to just those 5 values. They are simply anchors. Here is an example. If this area is 75% and this area is 50%, not only you can fine-tune those 2 values you put down as needed, but you can now easily see in between those 2 is a fairly smooth transition of gradient. So you would not put something darker than 75% in between, nor anything lighter than 50%. So this 5-value system is a great place to start, so you can have something to work on, and you can still use all the gradients under the sun. If this feels a little confusing, you will understand this point much more clearly later on as we do the follow-along exercises.